I installed some patch bay units in my studio, and as part of that I had to get some more rack cases to install them in, and at the end of the whole process I realised that I still had 1 U of rack space free, and so being the kind of completionist idiot that I am, I started looking about for weird and wonderful rack effects or rack synthesizers that I could pick up for cheap that might do some interesting things, and I ended up coming across the Roland D-110. Now the D-110 is a multi-timbre digital synthesizer which came out in the 1980s, I think it was 1988, which makes it the same age as me, so obviously it was fate that I should buy one, and I managed to find one for the rather modest price of 75 Great British pounds. Now before buying or committing to buy the D-110, I looked about online at different videos of it and I got really interested in the sounds that it produces. I think it was Audio Pills aka Mr. Bad Gear who described it as something like 80s sounds in a box, and I think that is a really accurate description, and it was particularly appealing to me because I currently or didn't then have any devices which could quickly and easily replicate that kind of classic vaporwave cheesy 80s sound, so that kind of sold me on the thing. Now the other reason though that this device was on the Bad Gear channel is because it is notoriously difficult to both use and program, and I think in one of the reviews that I looked up it said that the designer must have been a psychopath. And to be honest, after using it for just a wee while, I think there's probably something in that. Now I'm not going to run through all of the different features of it or the tech specs or anything like that. That would kind of be redundant at this point since it's now about 40 years old or something. No, it must be 30. I don't want to do the maths. Anyway, I'm just going to tell you some of the key features that I really like about it that I think are pretty useful for making music, and then I'm going to tell you about my experience of using it with all of its complexities and idiosyncrasies and all that kind of thing. So the first main feature that I really like about the D-110 is of course that it's multi-timbre. Now if you don't know what that is, you'll have to forgive me for my use of generic terms with my explanation, because every synthesizer or hardware company tends to refer to these things slightly differently, and there are specific terms used with the D-110 which I'm not going to use at the moment because it gets confusing. Anyway, in essence, multi-timbrality just means that you can have multiple different instruments playing at any one time. Now these might be polyphonic, and they usually are, but if you compare this to say a polyphonic synthesizer where it can only have one instrument or one sound playing multiple notes at once, a multi-timbre synth can have multiple different instruments playing usually multiple notes at any one time. So for example, with a multi-timbre synthesizer, on channel 1 you might have a piano playing, on channel 2 you might have some drums, on channel 3 you might have a bass, and all of them can play at once, which means it's quite a self-contained music production unit. Now the second thing that I really love about the D-110 is that it has multiple physical outputs. There's a bunch of additional 1/4 inch jacks on the rear. Now this is really useful, especially in a multi-timbre unit, because it means that you can then apply different processing to things such as your lead synth voice where you might want a big reverb and a chorus, to, you know, your drums where you might just want a compression and some distortion or something. Another nice thing about the D-110 is that the sounds are velocity sensitive. This isn't necessarily something that's all that new or unusual. It's definitely not new. However, it was a bit of a surprise, and it does give you nice kind of expressive capabilities over the sounds that are in there. Now the final thing that I want to highlight in terms of features, which I think is pretty good, is in relation to the memory card. Now whilst the D-110 takes a memory card where you can save or load patches, you don't actually need a memory card because there is an internal memory, and that's cool enough in of itself. But the thing that I really like about this in particular is that because the synth is so old, at some point the battery for the internal memory is going to need replaced, and often it can be a bit of a pain in the arse to do that. You have to go in and you have to desolder the battery. Sometimes these things take really weird batteries which can be hard to find, but I believe in the case of the D-110 it's a standard CR2032 coin battery which you can find anywhere really, and it also has a holder, so you don't even need to desolder anything, which just makes the whole process so much easier to kind of use and maintain. Now when it comes to the sounds of the D110, this is where things begin to get a wee bit more complicated because it uses something called linear arithmetic synthesis. Now I'm not going to pretend to know all the technical ins and outs of that in any great detail at all. However, my understanding is that in the early kind of nascent years of digital synthesis, linear arithmetic was meant to be a more straightforward approach to synthesis than something that is non-linear and more complicated like FM, for example. And if you've ever tried to program an FM synthesizer, you'll know what I'm talking about. So in theory, this is a great idea. However, in practice, it is actually still quite confusing. And that isn't really helped in the D110's case by having a manual, which has been described as one of the most obtuse things ever written. Now, the rough gist of how things work is that you have parts, which kind of act like instruments. You get 8 parts and you get a separate kind of drum track. And then you have patches, which are collections of all of the different parts and their settings and various global settings. So for example, you might have one patch where you have part 1 as an organ, part 2 as drums, part 3 as a bass, and then different MIDI channels and all that kind of thing. And then you might have a different patch which has part 1 as a bass sound, part 2 as a horn sound, part 3, you get the idea. The collections of the different parts and the various global and individual settings are contained within a patch. So it's kind of like presets of presets of presets, really. Now that is fairly straightforward, however things get a wee bit more complicated, or perhaps a lot more complicated when it comes to the sounds of the parts themselves. So the basic structure of the synthesis is as follows. You've got your 8 parts and your drum track, and within each of those parts, or along with each of those parts, you have an associated timbre. Now the timbre contains a tone, which is the sound effectively, but it also has a bunch of different settings that you can move around the different parts. So if you wanted a particular tone and settings to be on part 1 and then move it to part 3, you can do that. Now within the timbre, as I mentioned, you've got your tone, which is your sound, and the tone itself is made up of 4 different partials, as they're called. Now these partials can either be PCM based, so sample based effectively, or they can be some kind of synthesis engine, effectively with its own controls over, LFO and pitch and modulation and all that kind of thing. And you basically get your tone by combining these different partials, muting different ones, changing the way they run into each other or interact with each other and all that kind of thing. And using that, you can actually get not just realistic sounds like plucked bows or, bass guitar sounds or whatever, but you can also get some really kind of complicated and interesting sounds. Aside from the complexity of linear arithmetic synthesis itself, this isn't the only reason that the D110 is difficult to program, because even if you master the synthesis and all the weird structure that it's got, you still have to contend with various obstacles that the hardware throw at you. For a start, the screen is tiny and doesn't display a whole lot of information, and it's really not properly suited for a synthesizer of this complexity. As a result, you have to go through various menus and multiple layers of submenus in order to edit different parameters, and there's not really adequate visual indicators to tell you where you are or where you need to be or how you get there within the menu structure. So I often found myself getting very lost, not being able to find what I wanted to edit, and it just wasn't a particularly enjoyable experience. There are also some idiosyncrasies with how the D110 presents information. So for example, I believe it's the case that it doesn't tell you within the menu structure whether or not specific partials are muted or not, which would be quite useful to know when you're trying to, program a synthesizer which is dependent on knowing that. To top it all off, you have to interact with this horrible wee screen and convoluted menu structure by using a set of buttons which are fairly close together, tend to degrade quite badly over time and become intermittent to responses, and also don't particularly have any good visual indicators, which means that it just adds to the misery. Now there is a hardware programmer you can get called the PG-10, which gives you dedicated controls over a bunch of different parameters. However, these are like gold dust, and the only ones that I've found are something like £500, £600 online, which is about almost 10 times the cost of the synth itself, and so almost certainly not worth it at all. However, there is a saving grace here. There are various software programmers you can get which allow you to interact with the synth in a much more user-friendly way. You still have to deal with the complexity of linear arithmetic synthesis, but at least it lays it out in a way where everything, or at least multiple parameters, are on the screen at once, and you don't have to use those god-forsaken buttons or use that wee screen. So if you're interested in that, there's one called Patchbase, which is particularly good. However, that costs £40, which is not an insignificant amount of money. There is also another one called EdiSign, I believe is how you pronounce it, maybe. This is a free project which allows you to control a whole bunch of different vintage synthesizers, and that's the one I've been using. It can be a wee bit tricky to understand at times. However, I think that's largely the D110, and this is something I would highly recommend if you're using a D110, because it is really what helped me understand how everything works and is put together. So having used the D110 for a wee bit of time, what do I think of it? Well, I have to say that I'm actually fairly pleasantly surprised with it. Yes, it is complex, however, it's not quite as complicated as I thought it would be. Really, the whole kind of misery and problem of it is that you've got this quite complicated structure of synthesis combined with a really terrible and small user interface, and those two things together make it a nightmare to program. Oh, and of course the manual is terrible, there is also that. However, once you've kind of got over the initial learning curve and you start using one of those software programmers or a hardware programmer if you're lucky and find one at a good price, things become much easier to manipulate. You can quickly get some really, amazing sounds out of it, and ultimately that's what I really love. The sounds you get out of this are classic 80s. I don't have anything else that does anything near this kind of sound, and I love having all of that in a multi-tombro box where I can create whole tracks and not have to plug in anything else except a MIDI controller. It's brilliant. Of course, the other thing that's worth noting about the D110 is that you don't have to spend all of your time programming it. That is one of the things that is going to be a pain, but once you've kind of come up with a bunch of sounds that you like, you can save them as patches or as tones or whatever it is, and this means that you can use them in the future and not have to worry about programming the damn thing every single time you power it on. Now, I have to admit that whilst I have programmed a few of my own sounds and I've actually enjoyed the process of figuring it out, which I normally don't do actually, I have to say, buy a collection of patches from someone on YouTube called Synth. They have made a whole bunch of really amazing different presets or patches or whatever you want to call them. They've shared examples of them on their YouTube channel. You can pick up the sysx file from them for something like €10, and I would say it is well worth it because not only do they sound way better than the presets or patches that are included with the device itself, but also it means you can kind of get up and running without having to, tear your hair out trying to program things that you want. I don't know how much time they spent trying to figure out how to program things or to get the sounds they did, but respect. So that's my take on the D110. It is fairly complicated to program, to understand and to use. However, if you've got access to a laptop and you can download the free editing software and you've got a MIDI controller, then actually it's not all that awful to use, and once you've found sounds that you like, it's actually a really powerful and interesting device. I would recommend this to anybody who's interested in that classic kind of digital 80s sound. I, like I said, don't have anything else that makes that, and I'm really interested in exploring my new career as a synthwave artist. For now, if you've got any other suggestions for weird rack-mounted synthesizers or effects units, please let me know because I'm still on the lookout to fill up some more space.